Paul is contrasting it here with verse 14, which of course is talking about loving your neighbour as yourself. But verse 15, he says, if you bite and devour one another, take heed that you be not consumed one of another. And so he's talking about the strife and the division that's come into the church because of the Judaizers, because of the ones who brought in this false doctrine. You remember we read about it being like that yeast, that leaven that starts to leaven the whole batch. And so the whole church now is starting to be affected by this false doctrine. And he's saying, be careful you're not going to be consumed by this. Consumed physically, exhausting yourself with all this fighting and strife and trouble. Consumed spiritually, that you become spiritually exhausted over this. But also make sure that the reputation of your church even isn't consumed by this. That you become known as somewhere where there's strife and discord and no kind of unity of the spirit. What he's not talking about is people who bring the true gospel. What he's not talking about is people who are personally challenging their congregations with the gospel. Now that can lead to a division of sorts. Doctrine, there's a saying, doctrine brings division, and it does. But if it's true doctrine, yes, it will still bring division, but that's not what Paul's talking about. He's talking about false doctrine coming and bringing division. So whilst the truth of the gospel might divide people, might polarize people, that's not a bad thing. That's what you would expect from the truth of the gospel. That's what always happened when the true gospel went out. It divided people, didn't it? And Jesus say, I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. So there is that division that you would expect from the true gospel. But Paul here is talking about a different kind of division, a different kind of arguing, and that is that which is caused by false doctrine coming in and affecting, just like yeast, just like leaven, affecting the whole batch, so that everybody it becomes against each other, becomes devouring, metaphorically devouring one another in such strife. And then he says these wonderful two verses here in verse 16 and verse 17. I'm going to put the two together and I'll show you why in a moment. This I say then, verse 16, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusteth against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary the one to the other, so that ye cannot do the things that ye would. And I suppose there's two ways to read verse 17 here. One is to say that the flesh lusteth against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, and you cannot do the things that you would. In other words, you want to do the things of the Spirit, but the things of the flesh are stopping you from doing it because they're contrary to one another. That's one way to read it. Another way to read it is to say that the things of the Spirit are against the things of the flesh, therefore you cannot do the things of the flesh because of the Spirit. So you get what I'm saying? There's two positions you could take there. In order to understand which position is the correct one, we've got to look at verse 16 again, which says, this I say, walk in the Spirit, and ye shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. That's, I believe, the position that Paul's taking here. He's saying, look, if you are walking in the Spirit, then you cannot do the things that are contrary to the Spirit. You cannot do the things that are of the flesh. Let's compare it with Romans chapter 6. Romans chapter 6 and Romans 6 verse 12. Let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in the lusts thereof. Okay, so he's saying, don't let sin reign in your body so that you go through life obeying its lusts, obeying its desires. And I think that's what he's saying here in Galatians 16, is that if you're walking according to the Spirit, you're not going to be fulfilling those lusts. You're not going to be yielding yourself to the lusts of the flesh, because those natural desires stand in opposition to the Spirit of God. And so what he's saying here is that you no longer have to submit to the law of sin, that you are now given a choice, where before you became a Christian, that was your life. Submitting to your flesh was your life, doing that which you wanted to do, even if it was only internally in your mind. That's how you spent your time, doing really what you wanted to do. Now you become a Christian, everything changes, and you now have the power that you need to overcome temptation, to overcome that power of the flesh, that lust of the flesh. And if we turn to the first epistle of John, 1 John, very small but very significant verse here. In fact, we'll read from verse 1 John chapter 1 and verse 10. 1 John 1 verse 10. If we say that we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us. Okay, so if you're saying, I don't have any sin, I've never sinned, I don't need a saviour because I know I'm right, then the Apostle John is saying, you make God out to be a liar, because God says all have sinned. So if we say that we haven't sinned, we make him a liar, and that his word is not in us, then chapter 2 verse 1, my little children, these things write I unto you, that ye sin not. So the Apostle John is saying, look, the reason I'm writing all this stuff to you, the reason I'm writing this epistle to you and these words here, is so that you won't sin. Is to show you that actually it's possible to walk in complete obedience to God. It's actually possible to walk in holiness. Now, that's not what is sometimes called sinless perfection, because as human beings we haven't got perfect knowledge. So therefore there may be sins of omission that we commit and so on. But he's saying, as far as you know and understand as a Christian, it's possible for you to walk in obedience. It's possible for you not to give in to the lusts of your flesh. It's possible for you not to indulge the desires of your flesh. And in fact, if you walk according to the Spirit, ye shall not fulfill the lust of your flesh. And in fact, here in verse 17, he's saying, you cannot do. And some translations have you may not do, but here the King James puts, you cannot do those things of the flesh, as long as you are walking according to the Spirit.